The text message from my mother-in-law arrived while I was in the middle of a staff meeting at Maison Dorée. Eleanor, we've decided it's best if you don't attend the family dinner this Sunday. James will still come, of course. I stared at my phone, a smile playing at my lips despite the sting. If only Margaret knew that the exclusive restaurant she'd chosen for their family celebration, the one she'd been trying to get reservations at for months, was mine. The establishment she was so eager to impress her country club friends with belonged to the daughter-in-law she deemed not good enough for her precious son. I'd love to know which corner of the globe you're watching from. And if this story speaks to you, make sure to subscribe. Tomorrow's video is one you absolutely can't miss. I never planned to become a restaurateur. 5 years ago, I was simply Elena Reyes, a hardworking chef with immigrant parents who had sacrificed everything to give me an education. My father cleaned office buildings by night, while my mother worked as a seamstress, both of them pushing me toward opportunities they never had. Their tiny apartment above our family's bodega in East Village was crammed with secondhand furniture and priceless memories. The smell of my mother's ropa vieja simmering on Sunday afternoons. My father, teaching me to count change at the register when I was barely tall enough to see over the counter. Food was our language of love. While other families bonded over vacations we couldn't afford or activities that required membership fees, we connected through recipes passed down through generations. I learned to cook at my grandmother's side, standing on a wobbly stool to reach the counter, absorbing techniques no culinary school could teach. By 24, I'd worked my way up from dishwasher to sous chef at one of Manhattan's most respected restaurants. The hours were brutal. The pay barely covered my rent in a shared apartment with 3 roommates. But the dream of someday opening my own place kept me going through burned hands, aching feet, and endless double shifts. Then, James Whitley walked into my life. He came to the restaurant with a group of investment bankers celebrating a deal, ordering off menu and sending back perfectly prepared dishes. As the sous chef, I was sent to deal with the difficult table, expecting another entitled customer. Instead, I found James, tall, surprisingly humble despite his obvious wealth, and genuinely interested in the philosophy behind our menu. "The scallops were actually perfect," he confessed when I approached their table, looking genuinely contrite. "My colleagues insisted I send something back to assert dominance, or some nonsense. I'm sorry." His honesty caught me off guard. When he asked for my number as they were leaving, I surprised myself by giving it to him. Our worlds couldn't have been more different. He came from old money, Ivy League education, summer homes in the Hamptons. I came from resilience, hustle, and dreams bigger than my bank account. Our first date was nothing like I expected. Instead of taking me to some overpriced restaurant where I'd silently critique the techniques, James suggested we meet at a small farmer's market. "I figured you might enjoy selecting ingredients more than having someone else cook for you," he explained, helping me pick out heirloom tomatoes from a local vendor. We ended up at my tiny apartment, cooking together in a kitchen, barely big enough for one person. James chopped vegetables with surprising skill, explaining that his grandmother had insisted he learn the basics despite his mother's protests that cooking was for the help. 6 months later, we were inseparable. A year after that, he proposed during a surprise visit to my parents' apartment, asking for their blessing in halting Spanish he'd been practicing in secret. My father, usually stoic, embraced him with tears in his eyes. My mother slipped her own mother's ring into James's hand. A simple band with a tiny stone that meant more to me than any diamond ever could. The only shadow on our happiness was James's family, particularly his mother, Margaret. From our first meeting, her disapproval was palpable. She assessed me like a specimen under glass, noting my accent, which emerged more prominently when nervous, watching how I hesitated between multiple forks at formal dinners, smiling tightly when I mentioned my family's bodega. "How quaint," she'd say, somehow making the word sound like an insult. James has always had a charitable heart. If James noticed his mother's subtle barbs, he never acknowledged them. His father, William, was more distant than hostile, typically buried in his phone during family gatherings, emerging only to discuss markets or politics before retreating back into his digital fortress. The wedding was a study in compromise. Margaret pushed for a lavish affair at the Whitley estate in Connecticut. We've hosted every family wedding there for 3 generations, James. While I dreamed of something intimate, perhaps in the small courtyard behind my parents' church, we settled on a mid-sized celebration at a botanical garden, with both a justice of the peace and my family's priest officiating different parts of the ceremony. Margaret insisted on controlling the reception menu, dismissing my suggestions as too ethnic and overruling my family's offers to contribute traditional dishes. The resulting food was beautiful, but soulless. Technically perfect and utterly forgettable. It became a metaphor for my relationship with the Whitleys. Aesthetically, acceptable, but lacking any genuine warmth. After marriage, James and I settled into a comfortable rhythm. He continued his work in sustainable investment banking, the ethical black sheep of his family's financial empire, while I remained at the restaurant, eventually being promoted to executive chef. We purchased a modest brownstone in Brooklyn, choosing location and character over the Manhattan penthouse Margaret repeatedly told us was more suitable for a Whitley. Life was good, if occasionally complicated by family dynamics. Sunday dinners at the Whitley mansion were a monthly exercise in restraint. I'd bite my tongue through Margaret's passive-aggressive comments about my career. Cooking is such a physical profession, isn't it? My clothes. That's a bold choice for dinner, Eleanor. And our decision to delay having children. The Whitley name has continued uninterrupted for 7 generations, but I suppose traditions matter less to some people. James would squeeze my hand under the table, his silent signal of solidarity, though he rarely confronted his mother directly. "She'll come around," he'd assure me on our drives home. "She's just set in her ways." I wasn't convinced, but I loved him enough to keep trying. Then came the opportunity that would change everything. Philippe, the owner of the restaurant where I worked, announced his retirement. Rather than selling to a corporate group, he approached me first. "This place is like my child," he said in his thick French accent. "I want someone who will love it as I have." The asking price was steep but not impossible, especially with some investors. When I mentioned it to James, he immediately offered to back me completely. "This is your dream, Elena. Let me help make it happen." For once, I let go of my pride and accepted. We restructured our finances, took out loans against our brownstone, and I poured my life savings into becoming the sole owner of what would soon become Maison Dorée, my tribute to both my French mentor and my golden dreams. What James didn't know, what no one knew except my lawyer, was that I'd insisted the restaurant be purchased under my birth name, Elena Reyes, not my married name, Eleanor Whitley. It wasn't about deception, but about achievement. This was something I wanted to earn as myself, as the daughter of immigrants who had worked their fingers raw to give me opportunities. James understood my reasons without offense, another reminder of why I'd fallen in love with him. For the first year, I worked 18-hour days transforming Philippe's good restaurant into a great one. I revamped the menu to include elevated versions of dishes from my heritage alongside French classics, sourced ingredients from local farmers, including some from immigrant communities, rarely represented in fine dining, and cultivated relationships with food critics and influencers. The work was exhausting, but exhilarating. Critics raved about the unexpected fusion of techniques and authentic flavors elevated to art. Reservations became increasingly difficult to secure. James supported me through it all, bringing dinner to the restaurant on nights I couldn't come home, listening to my excited ramblings about new dish concepts, celebrating every positive review, as if it were his own achievement, and through it all, I kept the ownership quiet. Not secret exactly. My name was on the paperwork after all, but private. In the culinary world, I was still Chef Elena, maintaining the separation between my professional identity and my life as Eleanor Whitley. It wasn't intentional deception, just compartmentalization that somehow never resolved itself, until Margaret's text message changed everything. A lot of love and effort went into bringing this story to life. If you're enjoying it, we'd be so grateful if you'd subscribe to our channel. Now, back to where we left off. Margaret's text stared back at me from my phone screen, its casual cruelty typical of her approach to our relationship. I showed it to Diego, my head sommelier and closest friend at the restaurant, who let out a low whistle. "She has no idea you own this place, does she?" he asked, one eyebrow raised as he polished a wine glass to perfection. "Not a clue," I confirmed, tucking my phone away to focus on our staff meeting. "And she's specifically chosen Maison Doré to impress some visiting British aristocrat who's considering investing in William's new venture fund." Diego shook his head, amusement dancing in his eyes. "The universe has a wicked sense of humor, Chef." After our meeting, I retreated to my office, finally allowing myself to properly process Margaret's message. My relationship with my mother-in-law had always been complicated, but this direct exclusion marked a new low. I dialed James, who answered on the second ring. "Hey, love, how's your day?" His voice carried the relaxed warmth I'd fallen for years ago. "Your mother just uninvited me from Sunday's family dinner," I said, skipping pleasantries. "The one at Maison Doré." The silence on the other end told me this wasn't news to him. "Elena, I'm sorry." She told me she was planning to do this, and I told her it was unacceptable. Yet she did it anyway. I kept my voice steady. "And you're still going?" James sighed, the sound of him loosening his tie audible through the phone. I thought I could use the opportunity to confront her, make her understand this has to stop. "You've been saying that for 5 years, I pointed out, frustration seeping into my tone despite my efforts. James and I rarely fought, but his relationship with his mother was our recurring fault line. He couldn't seem to break free from patterns established in childhood. His role as mediator between his temperamental mother and distant father, the weight of family expectations he'd carried since birth, his reflexive avoidance of direct confrontation with Margaret. "It's different this time," he insisted. "She's gone too far. Plus, Sir Richard Blackwood will be there. He's only in town for the weekend, and his investment could finally help me launch the sustainability fund I've been working toward." The Sustainability Fund was James's passion project, a way to redirect some of the Whitley fortune toward environmental and social justice causes. Margaret and William had blocked his previous attempts, claiming the returns would be insufficient. "So, this dinner is about your fund?" I asked, pieces falling into place. "Partly," James admitted. Father finally convinced Mother that Sir Richard's influence would benefit the family reputation, even if the investment area is unconventional. But that doesn't excuse her excluding you. I considered my options, a plan forming. "Don't worry about it," I said, my tone deliberately lighter. "Handle your business meeting. We'll deal with your mother later." After hanging up, I called my parents. Though they'd never directly criticized the Whitleys, their perceptive eyes missed nothing. My mother answered in rapid Spanish, her voice instantly soothing some of my tension. "Mama, I need your advice," I said, switching to Spanish as I explained the situation. My mother listened without interruption, then asked simply, "What do you want to accomplish, Elenita?" It was her standard question whenever I faced conflict. Not, "What do you want to do?" but "What do you want to accomplish?" The distinction had guided me through many difficulties. "I want respect," I answered honestly. "Not just for me, but for what I've built." "What we've built," I added, thinking of my parents' sacrifices that had made my success possible. "Then show her who you are," my mother replied with quiet confidence. "Not who she thinks you are." My father took the phone next, his advice more direct. The best revenge is success, mija. You own the restaurant. Use that. After speaking with my parents, I reached out to Sophia, James's younger sister, and the only Whitley who had welcomed me unreservedly into the family. Unlike James, who navigated his mother's difficult personality through careful avoidance, Sophia confronted Margaret directly and frequently. Their relationship was strained as a result, with Sophia often excluded from family events, another point of contention between James and me. She's uninvited me from the Maison Dorée dinner, I explained when Sophia answered. That witch, Sophia said without hesitation. I'm not surprised, though. She's been especially horrible since your restaurant got that glowing review in the Times. Heaven forbid someone in the family accomplish something without Whitley money or connections. I hadn't considered that Margaret's recent escalation might be related to my professional success. The idea that she might feel threatened rather than merely disapproving put her behavior in a new light. Will you be at the dinner? I asked. Shockingly, yes. Mother needs to parade the whole family in front of Sir Richard. Except you, of course. She's been rehearsing her explanation for your absence. Something about you being called away on a family emergency. The irony of excluding you from your family while inventing a family emergency is apparently lost on her. Sophia paused, her tone shifting from angry to curious. Wait, did you say Maison Dorée? Isn't that my restaurant? Yes, I confirmed. She has no idea. Sophia's delighted laughter burst through the phone. Oh my God, Elena, this is perfect. What are you going to do? I'm not sure yet, I admitted. But I'm not going to let her exclusion go unanswered. Whatever you decide, I want front row seats, Sophia declared. It's about time someone stood up to her. Later that evening, I consulted with Diego and my head chef, Martine, both of whom had become family to me through the intensity of restaurant life. Martine had worked alongside me for years, starting as a line cook when I was still sous chef at Philippe's. She'd followed me when I took over, her loyalty matched only by her ferocious talent in the kitchen. You could accidentally double book the restaurant, Martine suggested, knife moving in a blur as she diced onions. Oops, so sorry. We had a computer glitch and gave away your table. Too petty, Diego countered, leaning against the prep table. Besides, we don't want to punish. The other guests are staff with Margaret's tantrum when that happens. He considered for a moment, swirling a glass of wine thoughtfully. What about creating a special menu just for their table? Things that look amazing but taste terrible. I smiled at their protective instincts but shook my head. I won't compromise the restaurant's standards, even for Margaret. Whatever happens, Maison Dorée's reputation stays intact. Then what? Martine asked. I thought about my mother's words, show her who you are, and my father's reminder that I owned the restaurant. The solution was suddenly clear. I'll serve them myself, I said. Not as Eleanor Whitley, Margaret's disappointing daughter-in-law, but as Elena Reyes, owner and executive chef of Maison Dorée. Diego and Martine exchanged looks. That's either brilliant or insane, Diego said. Maybe both. She'll recognize you immediately, Martine pointed out. Not necessarily, I mused. Margaret has a remarkable ability to look through service staff, as if they're invisible. Plus, I haven't worn my chef's whites or had my hair up around her in years. A slight change in presentation, and she'll see what she expects to see. Another employee, not her son's wife. As we refined the plan, I felt a weight lifting. For years, I'd responded to Margaret's subtle aggressions with polite restraint, taking the high road at James's request. Maybe it was time for a different approach, not stooping to her level, but not hiding who I was either. There's just one problem, Diego said as our planning session wound down. James, does he know what you're planning? I hesitated. James had always been caught in the middle, torn between loyalty to his mother and support for me. This would force him to choose sides definitively. Not yet, I admitted, but he will. That evening, I arrived home later than usual to find James waiting in our kitchen, a glass of red wine in hand and another poured for me. The concerned furrow of his brow told me he'd been mulling over our earlier conversation. "I called Mother back," he said as I hung my coat by the door. "I told her either you attend Sunday's dinner or neither of us will be there." I picked up the waiting glass of wine, savoring the rich Cabernet before responding. And she said, "That's my choice, but Sir Richard specifically requested a small gathering, and someone had to be removed from the guest list." He rubbed his temples, frustration evident. "She suggested that since you work in food service, you'd understand the importance of accommodating VIP guests." The casual dismissal of my career as mere food service was typical Margaret, but it stung nonetheless. 5 years of this subtle degradation had worn grooves in my patience. "So you backed down," I concluded, taking another sip of wine. James looked pained. "I didn't back down. I'm still going to confront her about this, but I need to do it in person. The Sustainability Fund is too important to jeopardize. You understand that, right?" I studied my husband's face, his genuine belief that he could finally stand up to his mother while simultaneously securing her cooperation for his project. The contradiction would have been amusing if it weren't so familiar. "Actually," I said, placing my glass on the counter, "I do have a solution. I'm going to be at Maison Dorée on Sunday." James looked confused. "You're going to show up anyway?" "Elena, that might not be the best. Not as a guest," I clarified. "As the owner and executive chef." Silence fell between us as James processed this information. "You're going to reveal that you own the restaurant? During dinner with Sir Richard?" The discomfort in his voice surprised me. "Is there a reason I shouldn't?" James hesitated, choosing his words carefully. "It's just, Mother has been telling everyone that securing this reservation was nearly impossible, that she had to call in personal favors. Finding out you own the place might be humiliating for her. So I should protect her pride while she publicly excludes me from a family event?" My voice remained calm despite the frustration building inside me. "James, at some point your mother needs to face consequences for her actions." "I know," he sighed, running a hand through his hair. "You're right. It's just, family dynamics are complicated." "More complicated than our marriage?" I challenged, the question hanging between us. Our relationship had always been a balancing act, James trying to evolve beyond his family's expectations without completely severing ties, me striving to remain authentic to my roots while navigating a world of privilege previously foreign to me. But lately, the scales seemed permanently tipped in favor of Whitley family politics. "Of course not," James insisted, moving to take my hands in his. "You're my priority, Elena, always. I just worry this confrontation might escalate things beyond repair." "Maybe that's necessary," I suggested. "Maybe we've been too concerned with keeping the peace and not concerned enough with establishing respect." James was quiet for a moment, conflicted emotions playing across his face. Finally, he nodded. "You're right. Do what you feel is necessary." "I'll support you." Despite his words, I sensed his reservation. James had always believed in gradual change, in working within systems rather than disrupting them. It was what made him effective in the financial world, patiently redirecting investments toward sustainable causes without alienating traditional investors. But patience hadn't improved Margaret's treatment of me. If anything, her hostility had only grown more pronounced over time. The next morning, I arrived at Maison Dorée earlier than usual to review the reservation details. Margaret had booked a table for 8 people at 7:30 p.m. under the Whitley name, requesting the best table and mentioning their distinguished British guest. Her special instructions included a champagne toast upon arrival and absolutely no spicy food, as she claimed Sir Richard had a sensitive palate. I smiled at this last note, remembering James's mention that Sir Richard had spent significant time in Thailand and India, developing not only a tolerance but a preference for boldly spiced cuisine. Margaret's assumption about his taste said more about her own limited perspective than anything else. As I reviewed the guest list, another detail caught my attention. Alongside expected names, William and Margaret Whitley, James Whitley, Sophia Whitley, Sir Richard Blackwood, were two I didn't recognize: Camille Spencer and her daughter Olivia. I texted Sophia, "Who are Camille and Olivia Spencer?" Her response came quickly. "Mother's latest matchmaking victims for James. Specifically for when you're unavailable. Camille is divorced, Daddy plays golf with her father, and Olivia is 24 and just adores finance." The revelation landed like a stone in my stomach. Margaret wasn't just excluding me from a family dinner, she was actively trying to pair James with another woman. The audacity was breathtaking, even for her. I called James immediately. When he answered, I could hear the bustle of his office in the background. "Did you know your mother invited Camille and Olivia Spencer to dinner?" I asked without a preamble. A pause then. "What?" "No, she told me it was just family and Sir Richard." I heard him exhale sharply. "Camille Spencer. Isn't she the one Mother kept mentioning at the Christmas party? The one whose father owns that shipping company?" "The very same," I confirmed. "Sophia says your mother is matchmaking." "That's ridiculous," James said, though his tone suggested he found it entirely plausible. "I'm married, happily married." "Your mother seems to view that as a temporary inconvenience," I replied, trying to keep the hurt from my voice. "This has gone too far," James said, and for the first time in our conversation about Margaret, I heard genuine anger in his voice. "I'll call her right now and cancel the entire dinner." "No," I said, an idea forming. "Don't cancel. Don't even let on that you know about the Spencers. Let's see this through." "Elena, she's trying to set me up with another woman at a dinner. She's excluded you from—" "How are you so calm about this?" The truth was, I wasn't calm. I was furious. But beneath the anger was something else. A clarity I hadn't felt in years of dealing with Margaret. She had finally overplayed her hand. Because for the first time, I see exactly who your mother is and what she's willing to do, I explained. No more subtle digs or plausible deniability. This is blatant disrespect, not just to me, but to you and our marriage. "All the more reason to confront her immediately," James insisted. "Or all the more reason to let her fully reveal herself," I countered. "Sunday night, everyone will see exactly who Margaret Whitley is, and exactly who I am." After hanging up, I gathered my senior staff, Diego, Martine, and my pastry chef Laurent, to finalize the plan for Sunday. We would create a special tasting menu that showcased the full range of Maison Doré's cuisine, including elevated versions of dishes from my heritage that Margaret had dismissed as too ethnic at our wedding. "Are you sure about this?" Laurent asked, his French accent thickening with concern. "Your mother-in-law sounds formidable." "That's one word for her," Diego muttered. "I'm sure," I confirmed. Margaret has spent 5 years trying to make me feel small. It's time she understood who she's really dealing with. As my team dispersed to their stations, I received a text from Sophia. "Just heard from Mother. She's now telling everyone you had to rush home to help family with immigration issues." Her expression of fake concern is Oscar-worthy. The final piece clicked into place. Margaret wasn't just excluding me or attempting to match James with someone more suitable. She was actively constructing a narrative that painted my family and background as problematic. She was using stereotypes about immigrants to explain my absence while simultaneously trying to replace me with someone from her social circle. For 5 years, I had maintained peace by compartmentalizing my life. Elena Reyes in the kitchen, Eleanor Whitley in Whitley family gatherings. Sunday night, those worlds would finally collide. Sunday arrived with the crisp certainty of autumn in New York. I spent the morning in Maison Doré's kitchen, working alongside my team to prepare components for the evening's special menu. The familiar rhythm of chopping, searing, and tasting centered me, a moving meditation that cleared my mind for what was to come. Chef, the sofrito base for the arroz con pollo is ready, Martine called from her station. We'd decided to elevate my grandmother's recipe, transforming the humble comfort food into a dish worthy of fine dining while preserving its soul. Around noon, I checked my phone to find 3 missed calls from James. We'd barely spoken since our conversation about the Spencers 2 days earlier. He'd been uncharacteristically quiet, withdrawing into the tense silence that always preceded Whitley family events. I returned his call during my break, standing in the small garden behind the restaurant where we grew herbs and edible flowers. The space was my sanctuary, a reminder of my father's careful tending of potted plants on our tiny fire escape when I was a child. "Elena," James answered immediately. "Where are you? I've been trying to reach you all morning." "At the restaurant," I replied. "Preparing for tonight. Is everything okay?" James hesitated, the silence stretching uncomfortably. "Mother called. Sir Richard had to change his schedule, so dinner's been moved to 6 instead of 7:30. My grip tightened on the phone. "She changed the reservation time without contacting the restaurant directly?" "Apparently, she spoke to someone named Michelle yesterday," James said. He assured her it wouldn't be a problem. Michelle was our maitre d' on Saturdays, but he wouldn't have authorized a time change for our busiest service without consulting me. "James, we don't have a record of this change. Sunday at 6 is peak dinner service. We're fully booked." "Mother, was quite clear that it had been arranged," James insisted, his voice taking on the defensive tone he often adopted when caught between us. "She said she confirmed with the restaurant. I checked our reservation system. Nothing had been changed, and no notes had been added to the Whitley booking. Either Margaret was lying, or she'd somehow convinced Michelle to make an unofficial change without documenting it. "I'll figure it out," I said, cutting off further discussion. "But James, you need to understand what's happening here. Your mother is deliberately creating chaos." "You don't know that," he countered. "It could be a simple miscommunication." Was inviting Camille Spencer a simple miscommunication? I challenged myself. Or telling people I'm missing dinner because of immigration issues? James sighed heavily. "Elena, I'm trying to navigate an impossible situation here. I've asked Mother to rescind the invitation to the Spencers, and I've corrected her story about your absence with anyone who matters. What more do you want from me?" The question hung between us, laden with years of unspoken frustration. What did I want from him? Support without having to demand it. Protection from his mother's machinations without having to enumerate every slight. Partnership that didn't require constant justification of my feelings. "I want you to see what's happening without me having to explain it," I finally answered. "I want you to choose us, our marriage, without hesitation." "I am choosing us," James insisted. "I've always chosen us, but I can't simply cut my family off entirely. You know that's not who I am." "I've never asked you to cut them off," I clarified. "I've only asked for boundaries and respect." We remained at an impasse, the fundamental tension of our marriage laid bare. James believed in handling family conflicts through careful diplomacy. I'd learned from experience that some behaviors only changed when confronted directly. After ending the call, I discovered that Margaret had indeed spoken to Michelle, who apologetically admitted she'd been so insistent about the time change that he'd agreed to see what he could do, but hadn't actually made the change in our system, knowing we were fully booked. Margaret had interpreted his politeness as confirmation. She was very intimidating, Michelle explained, looking miserable. She mentioned being personal friends with 3 of our investors. "We don't have investors," I reminded him. "I own the restaurant outright." "I know," he said, shamefaced. "But she was so convincing. I should have referred her to you immediately." I couldn't blame Michelle. Margaret's particular combination of entitlement and authority had been honed through decades of society manipulation. People rarely said no to her, and when they did, they typically regretted it. I called James back with the update. Your mother doesn't have a 6-hour reservation. We're fully booked until 7:30, which is when her actual reservation is scheduled. She's already told everyone the earlier time, James said, stress evident in his voice. Sir Richard has a flight. Later tonight. We need to be finished by 8:30 at the latest. That's not possible, I explained. We literally have other guests at those tables until at least 7:15. Elena, this dinner is critical for the Sustainability Fund, James pleaded. Can't you make an exception? Find some way to accommodate the change? The request stung. After everything, Margaret's exclusion, the Spencer invitation, the made-up story about my family, James was still asking me to bend over backward to accommodate his mother's manipulations. Let me understand this correctly, I said slowly. You want me to disrupt my restaurant's entire service, inconvenience other paying guests, and reward your mother's lie. Also, she can have dinner with a man she's trying to match with another. Woman in front of her son who happens to be married to me. Put so plainly, the absurdity of the situation was impossible to ignore. James was quiet for a long moment. When you put it that way, he finally said. Yes, when I put it that way, I agreed. James, this has to stop. Your mother created this problem, not me. The reservation remains at 7:30. After hanging up, I turned to find Diego standing nearby, having overheard at least part of the conversation. Family drama? He asked, arching an eyebrow. Margaret tried to change the reservation, time without actually confirming it, I explained. Now she expects me to rearrange the entire restaurant to accommodate her. Diego whistled low. Bold strategy. What are you going to do? I considered the options. I could relent, disrupting service and reinforcing Margaret's belief that rules didn't apply to her. I could stand firm on the original reservation time, likely triggering a scene when the Whitleys arrived early to find their table unavailable. Or I could find a third option, one that maintained the restaurant's integrity while addressing the immediate problem. We're going to create a special waiting area, I decided. If they arrive at 6, they'll be escorted to the private dining room for drinks and appetizers until their actual table is ready at 7:30. We'll make it feel exclusive rather than inconvenient. And you'll reveal yourself during this waiting period? Diego asked. I shook my head. No. Let them settle in first. I want the full impact of the revelation to happen when they're seated for the actual dinner. As we finalized the arrangements, I received a text from Sophia. Mother told me about the time change. This is a power play. Sir Richard's flight isn't until tomorrow morning. I checked. The confirmation of Margaret's manipulation wasn't surprising, but it hardened my resolve. This wasn't about a dinner reservation or a time change. It was about Margaret's ongoing campaign to undermine my relationship with James, my connection to his family, and now my professional domain. I texted back, "Thanks for the intel. Are you still coming?" Sophia's response was immediate. Wouldn't miss it for the world. Also, James called me. He sounds like he's finally waking up to Mother's games. Don't give up on him yet. I stared at her message, a complex mix of emotions washing over me. I hadn't given up on James, but I had grown tired of waiting for him to fully stand with me against his mother's machinations. Tonight would be a turning point one way or another. As evening approached, I changed into my chef's whites, pulling my hair back into a tight, professional bun, a look Margaret had never seen on me. I applied minimal makeup, emphasizing my features in a way that would make me recognizable upon close inspection, but not immediately identifiable to someone who typically looked past service staff. Ready, chef? Martine asked as the first dinner guests began to arrive. I surveyed my kitchen, the gleaming surfaces, the precise mise en place, my team's expectant faces, and felt a surge of pride in what we'd built here. Whatever happened with the Whitleys, tonight Maison Dorée was mine. This kitchen was mine. And for the first time in years, I felt fully myself, Not Eleanor Whitley, Margaret's disappointing daughter-in-law, but Elena Reyes, executive chef and owner. "Ready," I confirmed, tying my apron with practiced efficiency. "Let's show them what we're made of." At precisely 6:07 p.m., Margaret Whitley swept into Maison Dorée with the confidence of someone who expected the world to rearrange itself according to her desires. She wore a tailored navy dress and pearls, her silver hair styled in a sleek bob that emphasized her aristocratic features. William followed 2 steps behind, already looking bored, with James and Sophia trailing after them. The Spencers, Camille in a conservative beige ensemble and Olivia in a dress that seemed deliberately chosen to complement James's typical color palette, completed the procession, along with a distinguished older gentleman I assumed was Sir Richard. From my vantage point in the kitchen, I watched through the pass as Michelle greeted them with professional courtesy. "Good evening, Mrs. Whitley. Welcome to Maison Dorée," he said, not a hint of our earlier conversation in his tone. Margaret glanced around the packed dining room, her expression shifting from expectation to confusion. "We have a reservation for 6 o'clock. The Whitley party." Michelle consulted his tablet with practiced precision. "Yes, Mrs. Whitley. I have your reservation here for 7:30 p.m. As I mentioned when you called yesterday, we were unable to accommodate an earlier time due to being fully booked." Margaret's smile remained fixed, but I could see the tension in her shoulders. "There must be some misunderstanding. I spoke with you personally and confirmed the change." "I'm afraid not, madame," Michelle replied evenly. "However, we've prepared our private dining room for your party to enjoy drinks and appetizers until your table is ready." James stepped forward, placing a calming hand on his mother's arm. "That sounds perfect, thank you." Margaret looked as though she might argue further, but the presence of Sir Richard apparently outweighed her desire to create a scene. She nodded stiffly, allowing Michelle to lead the group toward the private room we'd prepared. Diego slipped into the kitchen, eyes bright with mischief. "Round 1 to Chef Elena," he murmured. "Your mother-in-law looks like she swallowed a lemon." "She's just getting started," I replied, focusing on plating the amuse-bouche we'd sent to the private room. Tiny arepas topped with braised short rib and pickled onion, a sophisticated nod to my Venezuelan heritage. "James looks uncomfortable," Diego added. "He keeps checking his phone and glancing toward the kitchen. Does he know you're here?" "He knows I'll be revealing myself during dinner," I confirmed. "But he doesn't know exactly how or when." I deliberately kept the details vague, partly because I was still formulating my approach and partly because I wasn't entirely certain where James stood. His call to Sophia suggested he was finally recognizing his mother's manipulations, but years of watching him choose the path of least resistance had taught me to be cautious. As I put the finishing touches on the appetizer plates, Martine peered through the pass. "Sophia is headed this way," she warned. "Looks like she ditched the private room." Moments later, James's sister burst into the kitchen, eyes widening as she took in my chef's whites and professional demeanor. "Oh my God, this is even better than I imagined," she exclaimed, rushing over to hug me. "Mother is absolutely seething about the reservation mix-up, but she's playing nice for Sir Richard, and James looks like he might combust from tension." "Should you be back here?" I asked, though I was genuinely happy to see my ally. "I told them I needed to use the restroom," Sophia explained, examining the appetizer plates with appreciation. "These look incredible. Are they arepas? Mother will have an aneurysm when she realizes she's eating Venezuelan food." "That's the plan," I confirmed. "Each course will showcase a different aspect of my heritage alongside French techniques." Sophia's expression grew more serious. "James told me about your fight. For what it's worth, I think he's finally seeing Mother clearly. When she tried to seat him next to Olivia, he deliberately switched place cards to sit by Father instead. This small act of rebellion wasn't exactly the dramatic stand I might have hoped for, but from James, who typically avoided conflict at all costs, it represented a meaningful step. How are the Spencers behaving? I asked, curious about the women Margaret had envisioned replacing me. Sophia rolled her eyes. Camille is practically genuflecting to Mother, and Olivia keeps mentioning her semester abroad in Spain like it gives her some special connection to your culture, as if all Spanish-speaking countries are interchangeable. The casual ignorance was exactly what I'd expect from someone Margaret would consider a suitable match for James. I should get back before they send a search party, Sophia said, squeezing my arm. But Elena, I'm proud of you for doing this. It's been a long time. Coming. After she left, I instructed the servers to deliver the first round of appetizers and wine pairings to the private room. Through strategic positioning of staff, I received regular updates on the Whitleys' reactions. Mrs. Whitley asked if there were any normal appetizers available, reported Lucia, one of our most experienced servers. Sir Richard, however, complimented the arepas and asked for details about the preparation. He apparently spent time in Caracas in his youth. I smiled at this information, imagining Margaret's discomfort at Sir Richard's enthusiastic response to food she'd likely dismissed as beneath her sophisticated palate. At 7:20, Michelle informed the Whitley party that their table was ready. From the kitchen, I watched as they were escorted to the best spot in the restaurant, a semi-private alcove with an excellent view of both the dining room and the garden. Margaret's expression suggested she was mollified by the premium placement, though the slight tightness around her mouth indicated lingering annoyance at the timing, inconvenience. Now came the moment I'd been planning for days. I instructed the servers to bring water and bread to the table, along with the wine list, but to inform the guests that Chef Elena will be personally attending to their menu this evening. As the family settled in, I took a deep breath, centering myself. Diego approached, adjusting my collar with brotherly affection. "You've got this, Chef," he assured me. "Remember, you're not just Eleanor Whitley in this restaurant. You're Elena Reyes, the culinary prodigy who transformed a good French restaurant into a great multicultural destination. The woman who earned a Michelin star through raw talent and relentless work ethic. The boss." His words bolstered my confidence. I had compartmentalized my identities for too long. Elena in the kitchen, Eleanor in Whitley family gatherings. Tonight, those worlds would collide, and I would finally be fully myself in both spaces. I waited until the first round of drinks had been ordered before making my entrance. As I approached the Whitley table, I saw James first, his expression, a mixture of anxiety and pride as he recognized me despite my professional attire. Sophia caught my eye next, barely suppressing a grin of anticipation. "Good evening," I said, my voice carrying the quiet authority I'd developed as a chef. "I'm Elena Reyes, executive chef and owner of Maison Dorée. I'll be creating a special tasting menu for you this evening." Margaret, who had been examining the wine list, looked up with the polite disinterest she typically reserved for service staff. For a heartbeat, she didn't recognize me, her gaze sliding past as she prepared to deliver her customary demands to someone she considered a mere employee. Then recognition dawned, her eyes widening as she took in my chef's whites, my professional demeanor, the respectful attention of the staff hovering nearby. She looked from me to James, comprehension and disbelief battling across her features. "Eleanor?" she finally managed, her voice higher than normal. "What is the meaning of this costume?" "It's Elena, actually," I corrected gently. "Elena Reyes. That's my name as a chef and the legal owner of this restaurant. The restaurant where you're currently enjoying dinner, the same dinner you specifically uninvited me from." The table fell silent, even William looking up from his phone to witness the unfolding scene. Sir Richard's eyebrows rose with interest, while Camille Spencer looked like she might sink through the floor in embarrassment. Only Sophia appeared delighted, leaning forward eagerly to catch every word. Margaret recovered quickly, her social training reasserting itself. "Well, this is unexpected," she said with a tight smile. "James didn't mention you worked here." I Don't work here, Margaret, I clarified, my tone professional but firm. I own this establishment. There's a difference, one I'd be happy to explain while I present your first course. The gauntlet was thrown. Margaret's carefully orchestrated evening was now completely beyond her control, and judging by the thunderous expression briefly crossing her face before she masked it with social politeness, she knew it. James reached for my hand, a public display of solidarity that spoke volumes in the context of his family. My wife, he said, emphasis on the possessive, is an extraordinary chef. We're lucky she's agreed to personally attend our meal tonight. For the first time since I'd known him, James had chosen a side unequivocally and publicly. Not the diplomatic middle ground, not the path of least resistance, but a clear stance beside me. The evening had only just begun, but already something fundamental had shifted. The tableau at the Whitley table remained frozen for several heartbeats. Margaret, stunned into rare speechlessness, James gripping my hand with unexpected fortitude, Sophia barely containing her glee. Sir Richard broke the silence with a hearty laugh that drew curious glances from nearby tables. "Brilliant," he exclaimed, his British accent more pronounced with enthusiasm. "Absolutely brilliant. I'd heard New York was full of delightful surprises, but this tops everything." He extended his hand to me. "Sir Richard Blackwood, I must say the arepas were exquisite. It reminded me of a little cafe in Caracas where I spent many pleasant afternoons in my younger days." His genuine warmth provided a welcome contrast to Margaret's frigid demeanor. I shook his hand, grateful for the social lifeline. "Thank you, Sir Richard. I'm glad you enjoyed them. My grandmother's recipe, with a few modern adaptations." "Family. Recipes are treasures," he agreed, glancing meaningfully around the table. "Though I suspect not all family values are equally treasured here." The pointed observation wasn't lost on anyone. Margaret's complexion flushed. Whether from anger or embarrassment was impossible to tell. William, surprisingly, seemed almost amused by the turn of events, examining me with newfound interest. "You actually own this place?" he asked, the first direct question he'd addressed to me in months. "The entire restaurant?" "Yes," I confirmed. "For nearly 2 years now." William nodded thoughtfully. "Impressive." The Times review was particularly glowing. I remember thinking the investor must be quite pleased with their return. "There are no investors," I clarified. "I purchased the restaurant outright." This information clearly surprised him. William Whitley regarded everything through the lens of financial transactions, and he'd apparently assumed my position was ceremonial rather than practical. A vanity title backed by serious money, likely James's. "Even more impressive," he said, raising his water glass in a small salute. Camille Spencer, who had been watching the exchange with increasing discomfort, attempted to salvage her position. "What a coincidence that we'd end up at your restaurant," she said with forced brightness. "Margaret mentioned you were dealing with family issues tonight. How fortunate that you were able to work instead." The emphasis on work conveyed volumes about her perception of my profession. To women like Camille and Margaret, being a chef, even an executive chef and owner, was trade work, fundamentally different from their world of charity boards and social committees. Before I could respond, Sophia jumped in. "Isn't it perfect? My mother specifically chose the restaurant owned by the very person she was trying to exclude. I couldn't have scripted it better myself." "Sophia," Margaret warned, finally finding her voice. "That's quite enough." "Oh, I don't think it's nearly enough," Sophia countered. "In fact, I think we're just getting started. Elena, what's on the menu tonight? Something special, I hope." I met her conspiratorial smile with a professional nod. "I've prepared a 7-course tasting menu that celebrates both my classical French training and my Venezuelan heritage. Each dish tells part of my story, where I come from, the path that led me here, and the culinary philosophy that earned us our Michelin star last year." Margaret's head snapped up at the mention of the prestigious award. Michelin star? This restaurant has a Michelin star? The disbelief in her tone might have stung once, but now it merely confirmed how little she'd bothered to know about my life. And accomplishments. James looked pained at his mother's transparent shock. "Yes, Mother," he said quietly. "I mentioned it when it happened. Elena's restaurant was one of only 7 in the city to receive a star last year. You said your wife had received some sort of professional recognition?" Margaret dismissed. "I assumed it was a local cooking contest or some such thing." The casual diminishment was so typical of Margaret that I almost laughed. No matter the achievement, she could minimize it with a few carefully chosen words. "Perhaps we should focus on enjoying Chef Reyes's acclaimed cuisine," Sir Richard suggested diplomatically, emphasizing my professional title. I, for one, am eager to experience the full tasting menu. "Of course," I agreed, grateful for his intervention. "I'll have your first course out shortly. In the meantime, Diego, our sommelier, will assist with wine pairings." As I turned to leave, James caught my wrist gently. "Elena," he said, his voice carrying clearly across the table, "I'm proud of you. Very proud." The simple declaration, delivered in front of his entire family, worked like a balm on years of accumulated hurts. I squeezed his hand in silent acknowledgement before returning to the kitchen, where my team awaited with barely contained curiosity. "Well?" Martine demanded as soon as I pushed through the door. "Did she faint? Throw wine? Demand to speak to the owner? Who are you?" "None of the above," I reported, moving to my station to begin plating the first course, a delicate sea bass crudo with citrus and chili, a dish that honored both my coastal heritage and French techniques. But her face when she recognized me was worth every minute of planning. As we worked, Diego returned from the dining room with an update. "Sir Richard ordered our best Sancerre and asked for your wine recommendations for the remaining courses," he reported. "Your mother-in-law tried to override his choice, but he smoothly ignored her. I think you have an ally there. What about James?" I asked, carefully placing micro-herbs with tweezers, each movement precise despite my inner turmoil. "He hasn't taken his eyes off the kitchen door since you left," Diego said. "And he moved seats. He's now directly opposite his mother, rather than adjacent to her. Creating distance, I'd say." These small acts of rebellion from James, the public expression of pride, the physical repositioning away from his mother's influence, represented significant shifts in our family dynamic. For years, he'd chosen the path of minimal resistance, accommodating his mother's behavior to keep the peace. Now he was finally taking a stand, however subtle. As the first course went out, I instructed the servers to inform the table that I would personally present each dish and explain its significance. This wasn't our usual practice even for VIP guests, but tonight was about more than food. It was about reclaiming my narrative, presenting myself wholly and authentically to the family that had only seen fragments of who I was. When I returned to the table with the first course, I found the dynamic subtly altered. Olivia Spencer had changed seats, now sitting beside Sophia rather than James. Camille appeared to be deep in conversation with Sir Richard, while Margaret sat in uncharacteristic silence, her posture rigid with controlled anger. "Our first course," I announced, as the servers placed the elegant plates before each guest, "is sea bass crudo with citrus and ají dulce, a sweet Venezuelan chili. This dish represents my earliest culinary memory, watching my father prepare fresh fish caught by local fishermen who sold their daily catch behind my grandmother's house in Puerto La Cruz." I saw various reactions around the table: appreciation from Sir Richard, surprise from William, who had likely never imagined me, with a background that didn't involve servants, and thinly veiled disdain from Margaret. "You actually grew up eating raw fish?" she asked, her tone suggesting I'd admitted to consuming dirt. "It's a coastal tradition," I explained evenly, "much like the sashimi you enjoyed at Nobu last month." James had mentioned their dinner, another, social event from which I'd been conveniently excluded. Margaret looked startled that I knew about the dinner, while Sophia failed to suppress a snort of laughter. The acidity from 3 citrus fruits, lime, grapefruit, and orange, partially cooks the fish, I continued professionally, while the chili and cilantro oil add complexity without overwhelming the delicate flavor. The technique demonstrates the natural fusion between my heritage and my classical training. As I finished speaking, Sir Richard took his first bite, his expression transforming to one of genuine pleasure. "Extraordinary," he declared. "The balance is perfect. Bright but not sharp, complex but not muddled. A remarkable start, chef." His use of my professional title wasn't lost on anyone at the table. By addressing me as chef, rather than Mrs. Whitley or Eleanor, he acknowledged my expertise and position independent of my marital status, a subtle but significant distinction in present company. Back in the kitchen, I found my team working, with focused energy, inspired by the night's unusual circumstances. Laurent, my pastry chef, approached with a question about the dessert course. "I've been thinking about the story element," he said. "The tres leches was your original plan. But what about incorporating the cinnamon custard from your wedding instead? The one your mother-in-law rejected for being too ethnic?" The suggestion was inspired. Margaret had insisted on traditional wedding cake, overruling my desire to serve my mother's natilla, a cinnamon-infused custard that had been part of every family celebration throughout my childhood. "Perfect," I agreed. "Let's add a quenelle, a vanilla bean ice cream, and a tuile with the MF monogram." MF stood for Maison Doré's original French name, Maison de la Famille, House of Family, but tonight it would serve as a subtle reminder of what family truly meant. As the evening progressed, I felt a strengthening resolve with each dish I presented, each story I shared. I wasn't just serving food. I was serving my truth, presented with the confidence I'd earned through years of professional success. For the first time since entering the Whitley orbit, I wasn't seeking approval or acceptance. I was simply Elena Reyes in her fullest form, chef, owner, daughter of immigrants, wife, and woman who had built something remarkable through talent and determination. The power dynamic with Margaret had fundamentally shifted, not because I was fighting her on her terms, but because I had finally, completely embraced my own. By the third course, a modern interpretation of arroz con pollo featuring saffron-infused risotto, confited chicken thigh, and crispy chicken skin, the atmosphere at the Whitley table had transformed. Sir Richard and William were engaged in animated conversation about the dishes. Sophia was documenting everything with barely concealed delight, and even Olivia Spencer had abandoned pretense to openly enjoy the food. Only Margaret maintained her rigid disapproval, taking minimal bites and pushing food around her plate in silent protest. Camille followed her lead, though I occasionally caught her sneaking appreciative tastes when she thought no one was looking. As I approached the fourth course, I overheard Sir Richard describing his recent investment in sustainable agriculture in South America. "The indigenous farming techniques are remarkable," he was explaining to William. "Completely carbon neutral and far more productive than conventional methods. That's why James's fund proposal intrigued me. It aligns perfectly with projects already underway in Venezuela and Colombia." "Venezuela?" Margaret interrupted, her tone sharp. "Isn't that rather unstable for serious investment?" I placed the next dish, braised short rib with yuca puree and a mole-inspired sauce, before her with professional precision. "Actually, there are remarkable opportunities for ethical investment in Venezuelan agriculture and food systems," I said. "My cousin manages a cooperative farm outside Caracas that's revolutionizing local supply chains." Sir Richard nodded enthusiastically. "Exactly the sort of initiative I've been supporting. Small-scale, community-driven enterprises have proven far more resilient than corporate operations, particularly in regions experiencing political complexity. Elena's family connections in the region could be invaluable for identifying legitimate partnership opportunities," James added, building on the conversation with unexpected confidence. She maintains relationships with several agricultural cooperatives through her restaurant sourcing. Margaret's expression soured further, clearly displeased to hear me described as an asset rather than a liability. I wasn't aware you still had such extensive ties to Venezuela, she said, making it sound like a character flaw. My heritage isn't something I've ever hidden, Margaret, I replied evenly. Though I understand why you might have missed it, given how rarely you've expressed interest in my background beyond how it might reflect on the Whitley name. The directness of my response created a momentary silence at the table. I'd never before addressed Margaret's dismissive attitude so explicitly, having always followed James's preference for maintaining peace through avoidance. Well, Margaret eventually managed, straightening her napkin unnecessarily. I simply meant that James never mentioned these business connections. There's quite a lot James hasn't needed to mention, I responded, maintaining my composure while serving the remaining plates. My professional achievements, my cultural heritage, my family connections, these aspects of my life exist independently of my marriage. They always have. James reached across the table, briefly touching my hand in solidarity. I've always admired Elena's self-sufficiency, he said, addressing the table but looking directly at his mother. She built her career through talent and hard work, not family connections or inherited privilege. The pointed comparison to the Whitley way of doing things wasn't lost on anyone. William actually chuckled, seeming almost pleased by his son's uncharacteristic assertiveness. The short rib is braised for 12 hours, I explained, shifting focus back to the food. The technique bridges my cultural background and French training. Slow cooking is fundamental to both culinary traditions, transforming humble ingredients into something extraordinary through patience and skill. Rather like building a successful business, Sir Richard observed, cutting into the perfectly tender meat. Or a meaningful life, for that matter. Precisely, I agreed. This dish honors my father, who worked night shifts cleaning office buildings for 15 years to give me educational opportunities he never had. He understood that meaningful transformations require time and sacrifice. Margaret, who had been lifting her fork, paused at this personal detail. Throughout our relationship, she'd managed to avoid learning such basic information about my family, preferring to imagine some vague, generic immigrant background, rather than acknowledging the specific, honorable reality of my parents' lives. Your father was a janitor? She asked, unable to keep the distaste from her voice. A maintenance supervisor, I corrected, though the distinction hardly mattered to someone like Margaret. He retired last year. My parents now split their time between New York and Puerto La Cruz, where they're renovating my grandmother's house. The mention of property ownership, however modest, seemed to recalibrate Margaret's assessment slightly. Property was something she understood as valuable, a tangible marker of worth in her rigid social hierarchy. The sauce is extraordinary, Sir Richard interjected, steering the conversation back to safer territory. I detect chocolate, but there's something else, a spice I can't quite identify. Ancho chile, I explained, grateful for his intervention. The sauce is inspired by Mexican mole, adapted through my own experimentation. The bitterness of the chocolate balances the richness of the meat, while the chili provides depth rather than heat. As the fourth course concluded, Diego approached the table with the wine pairing for the fifth course, a robust Spanish tempranillo that would complement the upcoming lamb dish. Mrs. Whitley, he said with impeccable professionalism, addressing Margaret, Chef Elena suggested this particular vintage might appeal to your palate. It's from a small family vineyard in Rioja with a remarkable history of female winemakers, spanning 7 generations. The thoughtful pairing was my olive branch, an acknowledgement that despite our differences, I respected Margaret as James's mother and was willing to consider her preferences. Diego presented the bottle with flourish, allowing Margaret to examine the label before pouring a small taste for her approval. For a moment, I thought she might reject the wine out of spite. Instead, she surprised me by taking a proper taste, considering it briefly, then nodding. Acceptable, she declared, which from Margaret was practically effusive praise. As Diego poured for the rest of the table, James caught my eye and mouthed, "Thank you," with genuine appreciation. He understood what the gesture represented, not surrender, but a demonstration that I could rise above petty conflicts while still maintaining my boundaries. When I returned to the kitchen to oversee the plating of the 5th course, Martine pulled me aside. "Everything okay out there, Chef? You look intense." "It's going better than expected," I admitted. "Sir Richard is clearly in James's corner for the investment fund. William seems almost impressed with the restaurant, and even the Spencers are. Enjoying the food despite themselves. And your mother-in-law?" I sighed. "Still Margaret, but at least she's not creating a scene." "Yet," Martine added with the pragmatism of someone who had witnessed countless family dramas play out over restaurant tables. Her caution proved prescient. As I approached the Whitley table with the 5th course, herb-crusted lamb with romesco sauce and saffron-scented vegetables, I could feel a shift in the atmosphere. Margaret sat straighter, a determined gleam in her eye that I recognized from previous confrontations. "Before we continue this elaborate presentation," she said as I began serving, "I feel I must address the elephant in the room." James tensed visibly. "Mother, this isn't the time." "On the contrary," Margaret interrupted. "This is precisely the time. We have Sir Richard here as our honored guest, and he deserves transparency about the unusual circumstances of this evening." Sir Richard raised an eyebrow. "I assure you, Mrs. Whitley, I'm finding the evening most illuminating as is." Margaret pressed on, undeterred. "Eleanor deliberately concealed her ownership of this restaurant from our family, creating tonight's spectacle for what can only be described as theatrical revenge." "Elena," I corrected automatically. "My professional name is Elena Reyes." "Your legal name," Margaret countered with cold precision, "is Eleanor Whitley. This dual identity seems calculated to maintain separate worlds, which raises questions about what else might be compartmentalized in your life." The insinuation hung in the air, that my separate professional identity somehow indicated dishonesty, rather than independence. It was a masterful pivot, attempting to transform my moment of strength into evidence of untrustworthiness. "Mother," James began, his voice carrying a warning note I'd rarely heard. I placed a hand on his shoulder. "It's all right, James." Turning to Margaret, I met her gaze directly. "You're right that I've maintained my birth name professionally. It honors my heritage and my individual achievements. But there was never any deception. The restaurant's ownership is a matter of public record. Had you ever expressed genuine interest in my career beyond how it reflects on your family, you would have known about Maison Doré long ago." William cleared his throat. "She has a point, Margaret. We've never exactly encouraged discussion of Elena's professional life." "That's because cooking is a job, not a career," Margaret retorted, the veneer of social politeness finally cracking. "It's a trade, like plumbing or carpentry. Necessary, certainly, but hardly the sort of occupation one discusses in polite society." The naked classism in her statement created an uncomfortable silence. Even Camille Spencer looked embarrassed by the declaration. "Yet here we are," Sir Richard observed mildly, "in a Michelin-starred establishment, enjoying a meal that demonstrates remarkable artistry and cultural depth, created by a chef whose talent has earned international recognition. I dare say that transcends mere trade work, wouldn't you agree?" Margaret's lips thinned to a tight line. "Richard, you don't understand the context. Eleanor deliberately excluded herself from family gatherings for years, citing work commitments. That apparently involved this restaurant. She chose her job over family obligations repeatedly." "That's not true," James interjected, finally finding his voice. "Elena has made every reasonable effort to attend family events. You're the one who scheduled them knowing they would conflict with her restaurant hours." The simple truth, stated plainly after years of diplomatic avoidance, seemed to stun Margaret, momentarily. Furthermore, James continued, gaining momentum, you specifically uninvited Elena from tonight's dinner, a dinner you deliberately scheduled at her restaurant without bothering to learn who owned it. And you invited another woman as what? My replacement date? While I'm happily married? The directness of his confrontation, so unlike James's usual conflict avoidance, shifted the dynamic at the table dramatically. For perhaps the first time in his adult life, James Whitley was openly challenging his mother's narrative, and doing so in defense of his wife. Margaret's composure finally cracked completely. "I was trying to protect you," she exclaimed, her voice rising enough to draw glances from nearby tables. "This marriage has always been a mismatch. Different backgrounds, different values, different social circles. I thought with time you'd see that and make appropriate adjustments." "Appropriate adjustments?" James repeated incredulously. "You mean divorce my wife and marry someone you've selected?" "Someone suitable," Margaret clarified, as if this were a perfectly reasonable explanation. "Someone who understands our world, our obligations, our traditions." Throughout this exchange, I remained standing beside the table, the beautifully plated lamb dishes growing cold as the long-simmering family conflict finally boiled over. Yet rather than feeling mortified by the public argument, I felt an unexpected calm. Margaret's mask had finally slipped completely, revealing the prejudice and social snobbery that had always motivated her behavior toward me. "I think," I said quietly, my voice cutting through the tension, "that we should continue this discussion after everyone has had a chance to enjoy their meal. The lamb is best served warm." The simple professional statement, prioritizing my guests' dining experience over personal drama, served as a powerful reminder of who I was in this space. Not just James's wife or Margaret's daughter-in-law, but Chef Elena Reyes, the woman whose talent and vision had created this acclaimed restaurant. Sir Richard broke the tension with a grateful nod. "An excellent suggestion, Chef. The food deserves our full attention." As the table reluctantly returned focus to their plates, I caught James's eye. Something had fundamentally changed in him tonight. A realization, perhaps, of how he had enabled his mother's behavior through years of diplomatic silence. The apologetic look he gave me carried a promise of continued conversation once this extraordinary evening concluded. I returned to the kitchen, my hands steady despite the confrontation. The climax I had anticipated had finally arrived, and though it had been painful, it had also been necessary. Margaret's true feelings were now in the open, where they could be addressed directly, rather than festering beneath layers of polite fiction. 2 more courses remained on our tasting menu. Whatever happened next, I would complete my culinary narrative with the same professionalism and authenticity that had brought me this far. The kitchen provided a momentary sanctuary from the emotional intensity of the dining room. As I supervised the preparation of our 6th course, a palate-cleansing coconut sorbet with lime granita and mint, Diego approached with a concerned expression. "That bad?" he asked, noting whatever he saw in my face. I shook my head, surprisingly calm despite the confrontation. "Actually, it's clarifying. Margaret finally said what she's been thinking for 5 years. No more subtext or polite fictions. And, James?" "Standing his ground," I said, unable to keep a note of surprise from my voice. For the first time since I've known him, he's directly challenging his mother, not diplomatically sidestepping or changing the subject, actually confronting her behavior. Martine looked up from where she was preparing components for the final savory course. "About time," she declared with characteristic bluntness. "That man has a spine after all." As we put the finishing touches on the sorbet, Sophia burst through the kitchen doors, eyes bright with excitement. "You're missing everything," she exclaimed. "After you left, James went full scorched earth. He told Mother that her behavior has been consistently disappointing and beneath the values the Whitley name supposedly represents. I've never seen him like this." "Is he okay?" I asked, genuinely concerned. For James, direct confrontation with his mother represented a seismic psychological shift. More than okay, Sophia assured me. It's like watching someone break free from a spell. Father is actually backing him up in his own emotionally constipated way. He told Mother that her social engineering has become tiresome. This detail genuinely surprised me. William Whitley typically remained above family conflicts, retreating into work or his phone rather than engaging directly. And the Spencers? I asked, curious about the women Margaret had invited to replace me. Sophia grinned mischievously. Camille made some excuse about a migraine and fled 10 minutes ago. Olivia's still there, looking like she'd rather be anywhere else. But Sir Richard is absolutely living for the drama. He keeps making these perfectly timed observations that somehow manage to support James while maintaining British politeness. My team exchanged glances, clearly entertained by the society. Drama unfolding in our dining room. I finished plating the sorbet, arranging the components with artistic precision despite the chaotic circumstances. Time for course 6, I announced, my professional demeanor reasserting itself. Whatever personal drama was occurring, I was still responsible for maintaining the restaurant's standards. When I returned to the Whitley table, the atmosphere had shifted again. Margaret sat in rigid silence, her complexion flushed with either anger or embarrassment. William appeared thoughtful, studying his wife with an appraising look I'd never seen before. James seemed simultaneously exhausted and energized, like someone who had finally set down a heavy burden they'd carried too long. Our 6th course, I announced with calm professionalism, is coconut sorbet with lime granita and mint. A palate cleanser inspired by my grandmother's coconut ice treats she would make during summer visits to Venezuela. As I placed the elegant glass coupes before each guest, Sir Richard caught my eye with a respectful nod. I must say, Chef Reyes, your ability to maintain professional composure under extraordinary circumstances is remarkable. Thank you, sir. Richard, I replied. In professional kitchens, we learn to separate personal circumstances from our obligation to our guests and our craft. A lesson some might benefit from applying to family dynamics as well, he observed, glancing pointedly toward Margaret. I continued serving, noting that Olivia Spencer looked profoundly uncomfortable, pushing her sorbet around rather than eating it. Sophia, by contrast, was enjoying both the dessert and the situation with equal enthusiasm. This is incredible, Elena, she declared, deliberately using my professional name. The texture is perfect. How do you get the coconut so creamy without dairy? Careful balance of coconut milk, coconut cream, and a touch of glucose syrup, I explained, appreciating her attempt to normalize the situation through genuine interest in the food. The molecular structure of coconut fat is different from dairy fat, requiring adjustments to achieve the right consistency. James tasted his sorbet, the cool refreshment seeming to center him after the emotional confrontation. I've never had this particular dessert before, he observed. Is it new to the menu? I developed it specifically for tonight, I confirmed. Each course is telling part of our story, my background, my training, the path that brought me here. Our story, James corrected gently, reaching for my hand as I stood beside him. Not just yours. The simple correction felt significant, an acknowledgement that despite his family's attempts to separate us through social politics, our narratives were intertwined by choice and commitment. Margaret, who had remained silent since her outburst, finally spoke. I suppose I should compliment the chef, she said stiffly, each word clearly costing her considerable pride. The food has been technically impressive. Coming from Margaret, this grudging acknowledgement was practically effusive praise. I nodded in professional acceptance of the comment, noting that she had deliberately avoided addressing me directly, a final, small attempt to maintain the separation between Eleanor Whitley and Chef Elena Reyes that I had spent the evening dismantling. Thank you, I replied simply. Our final savory course will be served shortly, followed by dessert. As I turned to leave, William surprised me by speaking up. Elena, a question, if I may. When I paused, he continued with uncharacteristic directness. Why keep the restaurant ownership quiet within the family? Was it deliberate concealment or simply compartmentalization? The question was surprisingly insightful from a man who had barely spoken 10 sentences to me in 5 years. Of marriage to his son, I considered my answer carefully. Both in different ways, I admitted. Initially, I wanted the restaurant to succeed or fail on its own merits, not because of any connection to the Whitley name. Later, as it became successful, I realized I valued having a professional identity that existed independently of family dynamics. William nodded thoughtfully. Makes sense. Keeping separate spheres of influence. He glanced at Margaret. Perhaps we all need spaces that aren't defined by family expectations. The observation seemed to hit Margaret particularly hard, suggesting tensions in their marriage I'd never been privy to before. She stared at her half-eaten sorbet, uncharacteristically silent. Back in the kitchen, we prepared the 7th course. Slow-roasted duck with cherry gastrique and seasonal vegetables, a dish that represented the height of my French classical. Training merged with contemporary techniques. As we worked, I felt a strange lightness. Whatever happened with the Whitley family after tonight, a fundamental shift had occurred. The careful compartmentalization I'd maintained for years had collapsed, forcing everyone, myself included, to confront the complete reality rather than the edited versions we presented to each other. When I returned with the 7th course, the conversation at the table had shifted to business matters. Sir Richard was describing sustainable investment opportunities to William, while James occasionally interjected with details about his proposed fund structure. Sophia was entertaining a clearly bored Olivia with animated stories about her recent travels in Southeast Asia. Only Margaret remained outside these conversations, isolated by her earlier outburst and subsequent silence. As I placed the duck before her, I noticed something unexpected in her expression, not anger or resentment, but something that almost resembled uncertainty. For a woman who had navigated her world with absolute confidence in her social position and judgment, this momentary vulnerability was striking. This duck, I explained to the table, is prepared using a technique I learned from Philippe, the previous owner of this restaurant and my mentor. The skin is cured for 24 hours before roasting, creating the perfect crisp texture while keeping the meat medium rare. It's remarkable, Sir Richard declared after his first bite. I've had duck prepared by chefs across Europe, and this compares favorably with the best of them. Thank you, I said, genuinely pleased by his enthusiasm. Philippe trained in Lyon under some of France's most celebrated chefs before coming to New York. He taught me that respecting traditional techniques doesn't mean being limited by them. A philosophy that extends beyond cuisine, I imagine, Sir Richard observed with a meaningful glance toward James and then Margaret. As the table enjoyed the final savory course, I noticed James watching his mother with a complex expression, part concern, part resolve. Whatever had been said during my absence in the kitchen had fundamentally altered their relationship. The diplomatic son who had always mediated and accommodated had finally established boundaries that wouldn't be easily crossed again. Instead of returning immediately to the kitchen, I paused beside James, placing a hand lightly on his shoulder. He reached up to cover it with his own, a public gesture of unity that would have been unthinkable at previous Whitley family gatherings. "Everything okay?" I asked quietly. "Getting there," he replied, with a small smile that acknowledged the understatement. "We've had some overdue conversations. Chef Reyes," Sir Richard called, drawing my attention. "I wonder if I might impose upon you for a restaurant tour before dessert. I'm particularly interested in seeing the kitchen that produces such extraordinary cuisine." The request was clearly designed to give the Whitley family space to continue, their private conversation while providing me with a graceful exit. I appreciated his diplomatic intervention. I'd be delighted. I agreed. Our kitchen is actually quite historic. The building dates to the 1920s, and we've preserved many original elements while modernizing the equipment. As Sir Richard and I departed, I caught a glimpse of James leaning toward his mother, speaking with quiet intensity. Whatever resolution they reached would be between them, mother and son navigating a new relationship without my presence as a convenient scapegoat for underlying tensions. For the first time since entering the Whitley orbit, I felt truly secure. In my position, not as Eleanor Whitley, daughter-in-law perpetually seeking approval, but as Elena Reyes, accomplished chef and woman comfortable in her own identity. As I led Sir Richard through Maison Doré's kitchen, I felt a curious sense of parallel worlds colliding. The professional realm I had built separately from my life as Eleanor Whitley was now fully exposed to a key figure in James's business sphere. "Impressive operation," Sir Richard commented, observing my team's coordinated movements with appreciation. "Military precision without rigidity. That's quite difficult to achieve in any organization." "It's about creating the right culture," I explained, gesturing toward Martine, who was meticulously inspecting plates before they left the pass. "Demanding excellence without fostering fear. My first chef threw plates when displeased. I promised. Myself, I'd never create that kind of toxic environment." Sir Richard nodded thoughtfully. "James speaks the same way about the investment fund he hopes to create. Excellence with humanity rather than intimidation. I see where the shared philosophy comes from." The observation surprised me. James and I had always supported each other's professional ambitions, but I'd never considered how our management values might have cross-pollinated over the years. "To be candid," Sir Richard continued as we moved toward the pastry station, "I'd already decided to invest in James's sustainability fund before tonight. His proposals were meticulously researched, his projections conservative yet promising. But after this evening," he paused, selecting his words carefully, "let's just say I'm even more convinced of his judgment and integrity." I understood the subtext. By standing up to his mother and supporting me, James had demonstrated a strength of character that impressed Sir Richard more than any business plan could have. "He's always had integrity," I said. "Sometimes he just needed permission to prioritize it over family peace." Sir Richard's expression softened with understanding. "Family obligations can be complex tethers, can't they? Particularly in families with established patterns." As Laurent presented his dessert preparations, explaining the Nutella custard that would form the centerpiece of our final course, I reflected on Sir Richard's observation. The Whitley family patterns had been established long before I entered. Their orbit, Margaret's controlling nature, William's emotional detachment, James's role as peacemaker, tonight represented the first significant disruption to those patterns in perhaps decades. When we returned to the dining room, I was surprised to find the table configuration had changed again. James now sat beside his mother rather than opposite her, speaking quietly. Sophia had moved to sit with her father, while Olivia Spencer had apparently departed entirely. "Ah, perfect timing," William announced as we approached. "We've just decided that James will present his fund proposal to the board next quarter, with my full endorsement." This was significant news. William had previously remained neutral regarding James's sustainability initiative, unwilling to directly oppose Margaret's resistance, but not actively supporting his son either. "That's wonderful," I said, genuinely pleased for James. His passion project had been in development for years, always stymied by family politics. "Sir Richard's involvement changes the calculus considerably," William explained. "Having his expertise associated with the venture addresses many of the board's concerns." James looked up, his expression suggesting this development had occurred during my kitchen tour with Sir Richard. "It seems tonight has been full of unexpected outcomes," he said, with a small smile directed toward me. "Indeed," Margaret agreed, her voice subdued but composed. The flush of anger had faded from her complexion, replaced by a carefully maintained dignity. Whatever conversations had occurred in my absence had apparently led to some form of resolution, though the tension remained palpable. As my team brought out the final course, the reimagined Nutella custard with a delicate cinnamon tuile and vanilla bean ice cream, I completed my culinary narrative. Our dessert is a modern interpretation of my mother's Nutella, a cinnamon custard that was part of every family celebration throughout my childhood, I explained, noting Margaret's slight flinch at the reminder of her rejection of this dish from our wedding menu. The recipe has been in my family for generations, taught to me by my mother as it was taught to her by my grandmother. Sir Richard took a bite, closing his eyes briefly in appreciation. Extraordinary. The texture is like velvet, and the cinnamon provides warmth without overwhelming the delicate vanilla notes. The custard is infused with both cinnamon and vanilla bean for 24 hours before being gently cooked, I explained. The slow infusion creates depth without requiring aggressive flavoring. Another lesson that extends beyond the kitchen, Sir Richard observed. Patience often yields more profound results than force. His comment hung in the air, its relevance to the evening's family drama unmistakable. Margaret studied her dessert, with unusual concentration, perhaps to avoid meeting anyone's gaze. "Elena," she finally said, using my preferred name for the first time. "This is quite good." The simple acknowledgement, devoid of qualifiers or backhanded components, represented a significant concession from a woman who rarely admitted error. "Thank you, Margaret," I replied simply. As the meal concluded, the typical awkwardness of family dinners was amplified by the evening's confrontations. William examined the check when it arrived, raising an eyebrow at finding it marked "compliments" of the chef, rather than with an actual total. "That's not necessary," he began, but I shook my head. "Tonight wasn't about money," I said firmly. "It was about recognition of my work, my heritage, and my place in this family, however complicated that might be." William considered this, then nodded with unexpected respect. "Well said, though I insist the staff be compensated appropriately for their excellent service." He removed several $100 bills from his wallet, placing them discreetly on the table. "Please ensure this is distributed fairly." As the group prepared to depart, James hung back, clearly intending to remain behind with me. Margaret hesitated, her social training apparently at war with the evening's new reality. "I suppose we should thank you for an educational evening," she finally said, her tone carefully neutral. "You're welcome at Maison Doré any time," I replied with professional courtesy, though perhaps next time a direct reservation would be simpler for everyone. Something like reluctant respect flickered across Margaret's features before she composed herself. "James, are you coming?" she asked, though it was clear she already knew the answer. "I'm staying to help Elena close up," he confirmed. "I'll see you at the board meeting on Tuesday." The reference to business rather than family obligations marked another subtle shift in their relationship, a move toward a more adult, professionally respectful connection rather than the emotionally entangled parent-child dynamic that had persisted well into his 30s. As the Whitley party departed, Sir Richard hung back briefly to shake my hand. "Chef Reyes, it's been a genuine pleasure. I suspect tonight marks the beginning of several new chapters, for your family, for James's fund, perhaps even for our professional collaboration, should you ever consider expanding your culinary enterprise." "One revelation at a time, Sir Richard," I replied with a smile. "But I appreciate the vote of confidence." Once they had gone, the restaurant gradually emptied of other diners as well. James sat at the bar, watching as I worked with my team to begin closing procedures. In the past, he had always seemed slightly out of place in my professional domain, careful not to intrude. Tonight, he observed with open interest and pride. When only the staff remained, Diego opened a bottle of champagne, pouring glasses for everyone. To Chef Elena, he toasted, raising his glass, who served the meal of a lifetime tonight, both literal and metaphorical. My team cheered, their support wrapping around me like a protective cloak. These people, Diego, Martine, Laurent, Michel, and all the others, had become a different kind of family over the years. One built on shared passion, mutual respect, and genuine appreciation rather than obligation or social expectation. James joined us, accepting a glass with a grateful nod to Diego. To all of you, he added, for supporting Elena not just tonight, but every night. I'm sorry it took me so long to fully understand what you've built here together. After the toast, as the staff dispersed to complete their closing tasks, James and I found a quiet moment in my office. He looked simultaneously, exhausted and exhilarated, like someone who had completed a marathon they'd been training for unknowingly their entire life. I should have done that years ago, he said simply. Confronted your mother? I asked. Chosen you, us, definitively and publicly. He took my hand, his expression earnest. I always thought I was keeping the peace, finding the middle path. I didn't realize I was actually enabling patterns that were hurting you, hurting us, and ultimately hurting my parents too. The self-awareness surprised me. James had always been empathetic and introspective, but his family blind spot had persisted throughout our relationship. What changed? I asked. Seeing you tonight, he answered without hesitation. Not as my wife, trying to accommodate my family, or as Eleanor Whitley navigating society events, but as Chef Elena Reyes in her element, confident, accomplished, unapologetically herself. It made me realize how much I've asked you to compartmentalize, to separate parts of yourself to make my family comfortable. He shook his head, genuine regret in his expression. You've never asked me to be less than my full self, yet I allowed my mother to demand exactly that from you. The acknowledgement was healing in a way I hadn't anticipated. For years, I'd thought the problem was simply Margaret's snobbery, or my unwillingness to fully assimilate into Whitley's social norms. I hadn't recognized how James's conflict avoidance had perpetuated the situation. Tonight changed things, I said. For all of us. Permanently, James agreed. Mother and I had a real conversation for the first time in maybe forever. Not pleasant, but real. She knows things can't go back to how they were. As we left the restaurant that night, walking hand in hand through the quiet streets of New York, I felt a new sense of wholeness. For 5 years, I had been living a divided life, Elena Reyes in the kitchen, Eleanor Whitley and Whitley family gatherings. The exhausting mental gymnastics of maintaining those separate identities had taken a toll I hadn't fully recognized until the weight was lifted. Whatever came next with the Whitley family would be navigated from this new place of integration. Messy, and uncomfortable at times, perhaps, but authentic. 3 months after the infamous Whitley dinner at Maison Dorée, I stood in my kitchen on a Sunday morning, the scent of brewing coffee and sizzling chorizo filling the air. James sat at our kitchen island, reviewing documents for his sustainability fund, which had received unanimous board approval the previous week. Sir Richard's backing had transformed the project from a family disagreement into a legitimate business opportunity, with even Margaret eventually voting in favor, though whether from conviction or social calculation remained unclear. My mother called again, James said, looking up from his papers. She wants to know if we're coming to Christmas at the estate. I flipped the tortilla I was warming, considering the invitation. In the month since our confrontation, Margaret. And I had established a cautious detente. She had visited the restaurant twice, once with William for a surprisingly pleasant dinner, and once for lunch with a group of her society friends, seemingly eager to establish herself as a patron of the now trendy establishment. Each visit had been marked by scrupulous politeness on both sides, neither of us referencing the dramatic revelations of that October evening. What do you think? I asked, sliding a breakfast plate in front of James, Huevos rancheros with my father's homemade chorizo recipe, a Sunday tradition in our home. I think we should go, James said after a thoughtful pause. Not to pretend everything's perfect, but because avoiding each other only reinforces the old patterns. Plus, he added with a small smile, Sophia threatened bodily harm if we left. Her alone with them for 3 days. I laughed, picturing his sister's dramatic text messages. Since the restaurant confrontation, Sophia and I had grown even closer, meeting weekly for lunch and collaborating on a charity project supporting immigrant food entrepreneurs, an initiative that had received surprising coverage in the society pages Margaret so valued. We'll go, I decided, joining James at the island with my own plate. But we're staying at the guest house, not in the main building. And I'm bringing food. I refuse to suffer through 3 days of their cook's bland holiday dinner. James grinned. Mother might see that as a criticism of her household management. Maybe she should, I replied, though without the bitterness that would have accompanied such a statement months ago. Tradition doesn't have to mean boring food. As we ate, I reflected on how much had changed since that pivotal night. The most significant shift wasn't with Margaret or the Whitley family, but within myself and my marriage. I was no longer compartmentalizing my identities or seeking approval I might never fully receive. James was no longer caught in the exhausting role of family diplomat, constantly mediating between his wife and his mother. I have news, James said, interrupting my thoughts. 2 pieces, actually. I raised an eyebrow, waiting for him to continue. First, Sir Richard has asked if you'd consider consulting on a series of sustainable restaurants he's backing in London, showcasing global cuisines prepared with locally sourced British ingredients. The opportunity was intriguing, a chance to expand my culinary influence without permanently relocating or abandoning Maison Dorée. I'd want Diego to handle things here while I'm gone, I mused, already considering the logistics. Of course, James agreed. The second piece of news is more personal. My father asked if we'd consider hosting the Whitley Foundation's annual spring gala at the restaurant. I nearly choked on my coffee. The Whitley Foundation Gala was Margaret's crowning social event each year, a carefully orchestrated display of family prestige and social connections that she had micromanaged for decades. Transferring it to my restaurant would be both a professional compliment and a significant relinquishing of control on her part. That's unexpected, I managed once I'd recovered. Whose idea was it? Really? Father's initially, James said. But Mother agreed. I think she's realized that fighting against your success makes her seem petty and out of touch. Better to associate herself with it and take some reflected glory. The assessment was probably accurate. Margaret Whitley had survived decades in New York society by adapting to changing circumstances rather than fighting losing battles. If Elena Reyes was now a culinary star in her own right, better to claim familial connection than maintain embarrassing hostility. I'll consider it, I said, not wanting to commit immediately. It would need to align with our restaurant values. No endangered seafood, ethically sourced ingredients, staff paid overtime for the extra work. James smiled. I expected nothing less. I'll tell Father it's a tentative yes, pending those conditions. Later that afternoon, my parents arrived for our monthly family dinner, another tradition that had emerged in the aftermath of the Whitley confrontation. Seeing my relationship with my own family suddenly in stark contrast to the Whitley dynamics, James had suggested we establish more regular connections with my parents, who had always maintained a respectful distance from our marriage. Mia, my father exclaimed, embracing me warmly before presenting a bag of homemade pastries. Your mother made pastelitos, the guava ones you like. My mother followed, carrying a pot of her famous black beans. I saw your feature in Food and Wine, she said proudly. My daughter talking about Venezuelan cuisine on those glossy pages. Your abuela would be so happy. The magazine spread had been another unexpected development following the Whitley dinner. A food writer who had been dining at Maison Dorée that night had been intrigued by the family drama playing out publicly, though she couldn't hear the specifics, and had returned the following week to interview me about my culinary journey. The resulting article, Elena Reyes, Bridging Cultures Through Cuisine, had generated significant attention in the food world. As my parents settled in, James emerged from his office to greet them warmly. The ease between them was relatively new. In the past, James had been politely affectionate but somewhat formal with my family, perhaps unconsciously mirroring the distance Margaret maintained with me. Now, he embraced my father with genuine warmth and accepted my mother's fussing over his too thin appearance with good-natured humor. "William called," he told me later, as we prepared for dinner. "He's considering establishing a scholarship fund for culinary students from immigrant backgrounds. He asked if you'd be on the selection committee." The offer represented another shift in the Whitley family approach. William, who had barely acknowledged my professional existence for years, was now seeking my expertise in his philanthropic efforts. Whether motivated by genuine awakening or pragmatic business sense, connecting the Whitley name to diversity initiatives offered significant PR value. The change was nonetheless meaningful. "I'd be happy to," I said, slicing vegetables for the salad. "Though I'd want to ensure it's more than just cosmetic diversity. Real support for students who need it." "I'll let him know," James replied. He also mentioned that Mother is taking cooking classes. French techniques, very basic level. I nearly dropped the phone. I laughed at the image of Margaret Whitley, who had spent decades defining herself in opposition to service work, donning an apron and learning to chop onions. Adaptation, not evolution, I noted, recalling our earlier conversation about her motives. "Maybe," James conceded. "But still, people can surprise you." My phone chimed with a text from Sophia. "Sir Richard is backing James's fund with double his initial commitment. Mother is suddenly your biggest fan. The hypocrisy is breathtaking." "Dinner next week?" I showed James the message, both of us chuckling at his sister's characteristic bluntness. "Your mother's biggest fan might be an exaggeration," I noted wryly. "Probably," he agreed. But who would have imagined even this level of acceptance 3 months ago? As we finished preparing dinner, I reflected on the complex journey that had led us here. The pivotal moment hadn't been the confrontation with Margaret, dramatic as it was. The true catalyst had been my decision to stop compartmentalizing myself, to bring my complete identity as Elena Reyes into every aspect of my life, including the Whitley family dynamics. That evening, as we sat around our dining table with my parents, my father telling animated stories about his childhood in Venezuela, my mother attempting to teach James Spanish phrases between courses, I felt a profound sense of integration. My worlds were no longer separate, but beautifully, messily interwoven. Later, after my parents had departed with leftovers and warm hugs, James and I stood in the kitchen cleaning up together, a companionable silence between us. "I've been thinking," he said, carefully drying a wine glass. "For years, I believed maintaining peace in my family was about finding middle ground, making compromises. I thought that's what being a good son meant. I waited, sensing he was working toward something important. What I didn't understand," he continued, "was that true family relationships can't be built on suppression or pretense. What my mother wanted wasn't real connection but compliance. From me, from my father, from you most of all." "And now?" I prompted gently. "Now I understand that real love, in families, in marriages, in any relationship, requires seeing and accepting the whole person," he said, setting down the glass to take my hands. "Not just the parts that fit our expectations or comfort zones." The insight was profound, particularly coming from someone raised in the Whitley tradition of appearance over authenticity, social standing over genuine connection. "I'm grateful for that night at the restaurant," he continued. "Not because it was easy. It was probably the most difficult night of my life. but because it finally broke patterns that would have eventually broken us. I leaned into him, appreciating the truth in his words. From compartmentalization to integration, I murmured. In cooking, we call that fusion, the bringing together of different elements to create something entirely new, honoring each component while transforming them into something greater than the sum of their parts. James smiled, pressing a kiss to my forehead. Chef Elena Reyes, finding culinary metaphors for life since always. It's how I make sense of the world, I admitted. Through food, flavor, the bringing together of seemingly disparate elements into harmony. Speaking of harmony, James said, a hint of mischief in his voice. Shall we RSVP to Mother's Christmas invitation with a list of the dishes you'll be bringing? I'm thinking of your spiced pernil as an alternative to her traditional bland roast, your coquito instead of that awful eggnog grandfather insisted on, and definitely your buñuelos rather than those dry Christmas cookies no one actually likes. I laughed at the deliberate provocativeness of the suggestion. Perhaps a more diplomatic approach, I suggested. We'll bring some dishes to complement the traditional menu. The compromise, assertive but not combative, represented our new approach to the Whitley family dynamics. No longer avoiding conflict at all costs, but not seeking it unnecessarily either. Standing firmly in my identity and worth without needing to diminish anyone else's. As we finished cleaning the kitchen, I felt a deep sense of peace. The journey. From that text message, Eleanor, we've decided it's best if you don't attend the family dinner this Sunday. To this moment had been transformative in ways I couldn't have anticipated. What had begun as an attempt to stand up for myself had become a catalyst for genuine change, not just within the Whitley family, but within myself. Margaret had unwittingly given me the greatest gift possible, the push I needed to finally, fully, integrate all aspects of myself into one authentic whole. Elena Reyes and Eleanor Whitley were no longer separate identities, but facets of the same complex, confident woman, chef, wife, daughter, daughter-in-law, entrepreneur, immigrant's child, and so much more. 1 year after the night that changed everything. I stood in Maison Doré's kitchen, surveying the controlled chaos of Sunday brunch service. The restaurant had evolved in the past 12 months, just as I had, growing more confident in its identity, more assured in its fusion of cultural influences, more comfortable embracing its unique position in the culinary landscape. Chef, the Whitley party has arrived, Michel announced, a hint of amusement in his voice. Table 7, as requested. What had once been a source of tension, the Whitley name, now carried a different energy. The monthly family brunch had become something of a tradition over the past 6 months, a neutral ground where new relationship patterns could emerge without the weight of Whitley Manor's history and hierarchy. Thank you, Michel, I replied, putting the finishing touches on a special appetizer I'd prepared for today's gathering. Please let them know I'll be out shortly. Diego appeared at my side, eyebrows raised in his characteristic expression. The famous Whitley brunch begins again. How many this time? 8, I answered, smiling. James's parents, Sophia, Sir Richard, who's in town for the fund's quarterly meeting, and my parents. The inclusion of my parents in these family gatherings was perhaps the most significant change of the past year. No longer kept separate from Whitley events, they now moved comfortably in this expanded family circle, their presence a constant reminder of the integration I'd fought for. Your mother-in-law actually requested your father's chorizo scramble, Diego noted, still sounding vaguely disbelieving despite having witnessed this evolution over months. If you'd told me that a year ago, I'd have suggested you cut back on the cooking wine? I laughed, remembering Margaret's initial reluctant tasting of my father's signature dish, followed by her surprisingly genuine appreciation. Small steps toward authentic connection, accumulated over time. As I made my way through the busy dining room toward table 7, I caught sight of the gathering. William engaged in animated conversation with my father about sustainable fishing practices. My father had worked briefly on fishing boats in his youth. Sophia showing my mother photos on her phone. James and Sir Richard apparently deep in business discussion. Margaret sat slightly apart, surveying the restaurant with the assessing gaze that had once intimidated me, but now simply registered as part of who she was. Elena. My father was the first to spot me, rising to embrace me with characteristic warmth. We were just discussing the Chilean sea bass on your menu. I was telling William about the naming controversy. It's not actually bass at all, William explained to Sir Richard, with the enthusiasm of someone who has discovered a fascinating fact others might not know. It's Patagonian toothfish. They renamed it for marketing because who wants to order something called toothfish at a fine restaurant? The ease with which William now engaged with culinary trivia, and with my father, would have been unimaginable a year ago. While not a complete transformation, his increased interest in the world beyond finance and Whitley family politics represented a genuine shift. Elena, darling. Margaret greeted me with air kisses, her standard social form. The restaurant looks wonderful as always. That feature in Architectural Digest did it justice, I think. The magazine spread, highlighting Maison Doré's unique blend of classic French architecture and contemporary warmth, had been a source of particular pride for Margaret since several of her social competitors had commented on it at a recent charity event. Thank you, Margaret, I replied, having long since made peace with her tendency to view my accomplishments through the lens of social currency. Some aspects of people never changed. The key was finding a way to accept them without being diminished by them. I took my seat beside James, who squeezed my hand under the table in our private gesture of connection. I've ordered a special menu for today, I announced to the table. A celebration of sorts. What are we celebrating? Sophia asked, always quick to anticipate good news. James and I exchanged glances, a silent confirmation passing between us. Several things, actually, he replied. First, as some of you already know, the Sustainability Fund has secured commitments for its initial investment round, 3 times our original target. Sir Richard raised his water glass in acknowledgement of his role in this success. The financial community is finally recognizing what some of us have long understood. Environmental sustainability and profit are not mutually exclusive. Second, I continued, Maison Doré will be opening a second location next spring. This announcement generated genuine surprise around the table. I'd kept the expansion plans relatively quiet until the contracts were finalized. Where? William asked with immediate interest, the businessman in him automatically assessing the investment potential. London, I replied, glancing at Sir Richard, who had been instrumental in the arrangements. A sister restaurant that will maintain our core philosophy while incorporating local British ingredients and traditions. Will you be relocating? Margaret asked, a hint of her old concern about family separation surfacing briefly. Not permanently, James assured her. We'll divide our time between New York and London during the initial launch phase, but Elena has appointed an exceptional chef de cuisine who will manage daily operations. The we was significant. James had reconfigured his work to allow for greater flexibility, recognizing that supporting my career might sometimes mean adapting his own professional path, just as I had made accommodations for his family obligations over the years. There's one more announcement, I said, meeting James's eyes again before turning to the table. A more personal one. My mother grabbed my father's hand, already sensing what was coming. Sophia leaned forward eagerly. We're expecting, James I confirmed, his voice filled with quiet joy. In about 7 months. The table erupted in celebration. Sophia's delighted squeal, my mother's emotional blessing in rapid Spanish, Sir Richard's hearty congratulations. William appeared genuinely moved, reaching over to clasp James's shoulder in a rare display of physical affection. Margaret's reaction was more complex, a flicker of emotions crossing her face before settling into a careful smile. "Wonderful news," she said, her tone measured but not insincere. "Your first child, the next generation." The phrase would once have filled me with dread, laden as it was with Whitley legacy expectations. Now, I could hear it simply as a grandmother's acknowledgement of family continuity, neither a threat nor a claim of ownership. "We've already discussed some traditions we want to establish," James said, his voice gentle but firm, the tone he had developed for setting boundaries with his mother. "A blend of both our cultural heritages, both our family histories." Margaret nodded, accepting this framing without protest, another small indicator of how far we had come. Of course, children should know where they come from, all parts of their heritage. As our special appetizer arrived, a sophisticated play on tequeños, Venezuelan cheese sticks that had been my childhood favorite, I watched the table with a sense of wonder at how much had changed in a single year. The dramatic confrontation at Maison Dorée had been necessary, a catalyst for transformation, but the real work had happened in the months that followed. The daily choices to communicate honestly, to maintain boundaries respectfully, to acknowledge differences without allowing them to divide. The path hadn't been perfectly smooth. There had been setbacks, moments when old patterns threatened to reassert themselves. Margaret occasionally still made comments that revealed her ingrained classism. I sometimes still reacted with defensive pride rather than confident self-assertion. But we had established a new foundation, one built on authenticity rather than appearance, on mutual respect rather than power dynamics. As I looked around at our expanded family, the Whitleys and the Reyeses, Sir Richard, who had become something of an uncle figure, Sophia, who had blossomed into her role as bridge builder between the generations, I felt profound gratitude for the journey that had brought us here. The text message that had once hurt and angered me. "Eleanor, we've decided it's best if you don't attend the family dinner this Sunday." Now seemed like the first domino in a necessary collapse of unsustainable patterns. Margaret had inadvertently given me the push I needed to stop compartmentalizing myself, to bring my whole identity into every aspect of my life. What I had initially viewed as a humiliating exclusion had become the catalyst for true inclusion, not just acceptance into the Whitley family circle, but the integration of my complete self into a life that no longer required separation between Elena Reyes, chef, and Eleanor Whitley, wife. As our meal progressed, I placed a hand gently on my still flat stomach, thinking about the child who would carry both Reyes and Whitley heritage. This baby would grow up witnessing authentic relationships rather than performative ones, understanding that family bonds are strengthened by honoring differences rather than suppressing them. "To family," James proposed, raising his glass in a toast. "In all its complex, beautiful, sometimes challenging forms." "To family," we echoed, our glasses meeting above the table that had become our monthly gathering place. In the kitchen beyond, my team continued their choreographed dance of culinary creation. In the dining room around us, other families and friends shared meals and moments. And at our table, the boundaries that had once seemed so rigid, between cultures, between classes, between identities, had softened into something more permeable, more human. The restaurant my mother-in-law had chosen for a family dinner from which I was excluded had become the very place where a new, more inclusive family narrative was being written. The ultimate irony, perhaps, but also the perfect resolution. A reminder that sometimes the most painful exclusions can ultimately lead us to the most meaningful belonging, if we have the courage to stand fully in our truth along the way. Looking for more? We've got 2 amazing stories ready for you right on screen. If this one touched you, these are absolutely worth your time. Click to watch them now. And hey, subscribe and hit that bell to never miss our latest uploads.